He's good. Hey guys, thank you for joining me. This is part one of the boat build. In this part one, you'll see me get to this point. We've prepared the inside for the fiberglass, which will be the beginning of part two, and then I'll do all the woodwork on the inside, all the gunnels and everything else. But just preparing the hull up till now was a challenge. I thought I'd be finished a lot sooner, but with life and the way things go, I started in May. Here it is December. And a big shout out to Carolina Shoes. The name of the boat's going to be called the Carolina once we get ready. Right there, you see that? Right like that. Thank you to Carolina Shoes and Type Bond and Total Boat and Bear Mountain Boats and everybody that supported me on this build. And have a wonderful Christmas and enjoy this. I do a voiceover because it's Christmas and I just want to be part of the action. Okay, Merry Christmas everybody. I'm doing a voiceover because I'm just assuming it's a Christmas day and people will have time to sit around and we can spend Christmas together. These are the plans for the Rice Lake Skiff. These are the paper plans designed by Steve Killen for Bear Mountain Boats. And with these plans is everything I need to know to build this boat. I first saw this boat when I was up in Canada. I was at an event, Maker Rendezvous, that Bear Mountain Boats held together. My friend Joan kicked off the Maker Rendezvous just before COVID, so we haven't had a second one. But at that, there was a rendezvous of boats on the lake. And I saw somebody with this beautiful little rowboat. It had a little motor on the back. And I said, I need to make one of those. So I got the plans in the fall of 2019. And, of course, life gets in the way. And I want to make it right away. But it wasn't until May of this year that I actually began to make it. Now, if you were the average purchaser, you could buy the stations, or you can buy the plans and make the stations yourself with the plans. But they don't typically give out the CNC files. Steve gave them to me because of the video component that I was doing here. But they would provide the CNC'd boat stations for you. But I think they just don't want the plans to be emailed around for free. So that's why they're not provided to the general public. And I took a few sheets of plywood on the ShopBot CNC. A little history lesson. The ShopBot CNC was started by the owners of ShopBot because they were making boat stations. So they were very excited to see me making boat stations again on the same CNC machine. This is the same machine that I used when I made the canoe. And the canoe was also a Bear Mountain Boats set of plans. The difference between the canoe and this Rice Lake Skiff, or this 13.5-foot rowboat, is this is going to have a flat back, and I was given the wood for the canoe, and the wood consisted of cedar strips with the cove and the cove, so that one piece could fit snugly into the other regardless of the angle of incidence. This is the same strong back I use for the canoe, obviously, and I gave Paul Jackman the boat stations for the canoe. So hopefully Paul will make a canoe. He has the same boat stations that I used, but I kept the strong back knowing that I was going to make another boat. Strong back's obviously just made up out of plywood, and so now these are the boat stations all going in, the mold stations going in order. Again, another difference between the mold stations between this and the canoe is the mold stations of the canoe were the same from the center left and the center right. These are all individually different because this boat has a continuously different shape from one end all the way to the front. The canoe is basically mirrored from the center left and center right. And here, this is going to be the mold for the stem, and you'll see me making the stem shortly. Now, I put those pieces in between because these boat stations got pretty big and they were a bit floppy-doppy, so I wanted to just put that in there. Now, many of you guys remember a few videos back, I redid my deck in the front of the house, and this is much of the wood. There's a lot of it. There's a few truckloads, and here you could see my friend Brooke pulling all the wood up off of the deck. Now, this wood was installed maybe 100 years ago, and at the time it was cut down. It was probably a couple 100-year-old trees, but here you could see up close the wood with all the lead paint on it. And this wood is Doug fir with a very, very, very tight grain pattern. because it's such old growth wood. It is actually incredible. In just a small, maybe 1 inch, there's 50, 60 grain patterns, which is incredible. It's all quarter sawn. And so the fact that I saved this was actually, I pat myself on the back, because for a minute I was just going to throw it right in the fire as we were ripping it off the deck just to get rid of it, but I saved it all, and I have all the rest of it as well. So here we're prepping it. Joey pulled the nails out. That's my brother Joseph, my oldest brother. I'm the third of 3 boys, the third youngest, and then my sister is younger than me. Now here you see me preparing the wood that's going to be the stem. And I'm using the newer wood that I used on the deck. This is leftover planks for the modern version of the front porch of my house, the deck on the front porch. This is the red grandis, or the eucalyptus, that I used. It obviously got a lot of leftovers, so I used it up on the boat here. I'm making thin strips. Now I could have steam bent this, but since the strips were so thin, I didn't need to steam bend it, and I'm using my old trusted Type Bond number 3, which gives you a lot of open time, and it dries dark, which I like, and it's also waterproof, water resistant, I don't know, whatever you call it. But there you see. Now I'm bending this around the mold station there, or that's the stem mold, and that's why we needed those holes. Those holes provide the clamping pressure. But you notice how I tape one end together and the rest is left loose. Now I could have steamed this, but I didn't think it was necessary because it was all bendy enough. Now if that was a short bend, and I probably would have had to steam it. But here I glued it, bent it, and left it. And now once this dries, I need to make the outer stem. That's the inner stem. Now I'm also making the backer, or the transom, the back of the boat. This is going to be the back of the boat. So at one end the planks get glued to the transom, and all the way at the other end they get glued to the stem, which all still needs to be shaped. So I'm just making up my block. So while that glue dries, I go back over to the stem and I prepare it a little bit. This needs plenty of shaping. I'm just getting rid of the glue so that I could make the outer stem. And I threw them all through the saw, and now I'm just planing them all a little bit just to give them a little bit more pliability. And this red granite is a little, it's a little heavy, and it's also not extremely flexible. It's a little brittle. It's kind of almost like it's like a teak in a way, which isn't really meant to be bent all that much. But in small, thin laminates, it's obviously thin enough to bend. And you see here I'm putting those blocks of wood on there because when I clamped, that last piece still wanted to go straight. So those clamps provided pressure across the whole width of the laminate. Because if I just used just the clamp itself, it was pushing down in the middle and the wood was kind of butterflying up around the clamp. And so everything is nice and tight. Now this is May. I began this build in May, and now here it is December. So May, June, 7 months. If you're going to build a boat, devote a lot of time, and devote a space that you can devote a lot of time to that space as well. Now this is the transom, and you'll see here I kind of had to layer it a little bit to make it a little bit wider. That last mold station is the transom. And so I use it as my shape. And now that's the shape at the top, so I'm just using a little piece of flexible wood. And I'm using my big giant bandsaw. And once I put the transom in place, I have to make all the curves fair. So you see it's obviously perfectly square to the table of the bandsaw. But now you'll notice I'm using one of these rasps. You can get that at Rockler Woodworking. It's a great rasp. It's a Shinto, I think it's called. It's like almost a bunch of hacksaw blades all riveted together, and it could pretty much cut anything. There's a fine side and a rough side. So I took the Shinto and I added a long piece of wood. So the long piece of wood is riding the next station. So I'm getting the angle transferred. So now if you're a long strip of wood, the long strip of wood is going to come along all the stations and then fair curve right into the transom. Now this is me pulling off the outer stem, which then gets put to the side. That gets shaped much later in the process. that same concept that I did with the Shinto at the back, I'm going to have to do here as well. Now I'm pulling this off just to get it cleaned up. Now I have to keep taking it off and putting it back on. I want to make sure that I save my screw holes. Now I used my buddy Tony made this hand plane for me, and I pretty much used it the entire build. Now I'm going back on there. So every strip from the back to the front is going to be glued to this. And there you see that same process. I have the rasp following the curves that would be made up if a strip of wood came around each one of those stations. And it's a tremendous amount of physical work, and it's you got to be devoted. And thank you to my Carolina boots to keeping me comfortable in the shop. My jam. And using the hand planes when I can, using the rasps when I can. And now I'm preparing the wood that is going to be the planks. Out of each one of these 1x4s, I get 4 1/4 by 1 inch pieces. Now the difference between this and cedar is much more flexible, and the other problem I had to deal with is the fact that each one of these boards is no longer than, I think the longest set of boards I had was 8 or 9 feet. So every single run front to back has a scarf joint in it. And there you see the paint coming off. And I set up a system here where all the planks were same size and had the vacuum sucking up all the lead paint. And there's my brother on one side of the saw. I'm on the other side of the saw. Now I had a plan to make sure all the good clean wood faced out, and anything that had severe staining or paint or any kind of texture from the weather would face in, so that ultimately I could use all the wood facing in to create a reminiscent texture of where all this wood came from, because the inside gets a lot of woodwork. And right here you see this is a little jig I made because I knew I was going to have to make lots and lots of scarf joints, and I wanted to make sure that they would always be the same. So I set up this little jig so that the scarf joints would match. Sometimes I cut underneath that little piece of wood, and sometimes I cut on top of it, but it doesn't matter because it keeps giving me that same angle. And in some of the early planking, I glued up my scarf joints on the ground. So I would have myself a prepared 15-foot long strip. And here you see me doing that right now. And I use the weights from my strong hand table just to keep everything perpendicular while everything dried. Squeeze clamps. So I kept preparing long strips of wood over and over and over. I got to a point now where I couldn't really bend. Sometimes the wood got to a point where it had to bend so severely that those scarf joints kept breaking. And here you see me preparing these stations so that I don't end up gluing the entire boat to the stations. It's important to create some of these barriers. The most important thing with doing a boat is the stick-to-itiveness. I can't emphasize this enough, and I'll probably say it 10 more times in the next 30 minutes. If you are going to make a boat, you have to be fully dedicated. So if you decide you want to try and do this, just know that you need to devote a lot of time to it. If at the very least, think of it like exercise. Maybe a couple hours every other day, just so you can keep the project moving along. That is, I could tell, the biggest problem. A lot of people have half-built boats. It's just like a car restoration. By the way, you see I'm laying down the very first plank, and I use these various little hooks. I kept making these little hooks on the bandsaw to keep these parts in place. Now, this is the most important, gluing down the very first clamp, and you'll find all the various different jigs and ways to rig up clamping pressure. You'll see there I have those little screw clamps. I have a set from Rockler, and I have a bunch of different ones from Jurgensen. Now you see that skinny little, I didn't realize that till I was right about here, and I was like, oh, I wish that wasn't so skinny right there under the clamp. But whatever, I left it and it sanded right in. Nobody knows, can't see it. So the very first planks are the beginning. And now with my Type on 3, I'm starting to lay down new clamps and new planks. And you see I prepare the planks up in place over, and I have these little clips that I made, and these clips change shape a little bit throughout the build. And it's easy when you have 2 planks. You can just tape them together. And then when you start getting 4 and 5 and 6 and 10. Now this is when I don't have the bead in the cove like a typical, the wood that would be prepared, say, for the canoe if you were to buy your Bear Mountain Boats wood. Each plank has to be perpendicular, so I made this shoulder plane with a little guide on it so that it could ride along the stations. And it prepares any kind of twist and turn that that piece of wood might have, gets cut out of it so that I can get as tight as possible. Now I'm a little bit of a hack woodworker, but I did do the best I could to get each one of those joints as tight as possible to one another. And so every single board gets hand planed before it gets put next to the other board. And black tape, I learned from my friend Patrick, the electrician, Pat Reynolds, is extremely versatile. It's not just for electric. And I use it kind of like a thin, almost like a stretch wrap. And now you see here with this hand plane, the shoulder plane, works better on the pull than on the push. I can control it. And that guide has like a bullet. Well, not yet. You see, it doesn't have the bullet nose yet because every time I use it, it kept banging my knuckles. And then I put a bullet shape on the end so it doesn't keep hitting the stations. And the way I attached that piece of wood to the shoulder plane was with CA glue, which just breaks right off later on. And this is very exciting. I'm starting to see some progress. I'm starting to see the curves. And again, there's that hand plane. I used this quite a bit until I ended up getting a different one later on. Then I went on Amazon and I found a different one. I'll show you that one when it comes up. Here I'm putting an accent. This is going to be just underneath the gunnels or the outrails. And this is a strip of Wenge. When I very first met Derek from Malden, my partner on the TV show, thank you Carolina Shoes. I dropped in some Carolina. These are really great, these Carolina boots. They kind of have this durable toe, and I'm always down on my hands and knees. And so the toe doesn't wear out. They're great. Again, doing some more of this tape job. Later on, I have to I figure out a different method, which starts compressing, because once I get up and over that curve, the tape pressure is in a different direction. It doesn't necessarily pull it into it. It pulls it almost away from it. Now, this is probably a month in. I started very strongly. I started with a lot of gusto. And then got involved in a few other summer projects, building the barn in the backyard, and get a little bit sidetracked. But you see, it's important. I kept preparing the pieces I was going to glue just above it. Squeeze clamps are a huge part of this job. And I actually did something interesting with the squeeze clamp that holds the planks on the stem. I showed it on Instagram quite a bit. Thank you to my Suzanne Saw. Cezanne. Links below. And now here you can see how that hand plane is matching the curve of the boat. But you'll notice a couple times where the planks were pulling off of the stations, I just put a piece of wood over it and threw a little air nail in there. And I wasn't overly concerned about holes and pinholes and stuff because all this wood was used anyway. There's various nail holes in it all over it. And I wanted a lot of that texture to remain. I want you to be able to tell that this wood was something else first. As part of the transformation process. I find it quite beautiful to notice when you take a close look that this material is living its second life. So I came up with this idea, these just little CNC clamps, thank you ShopBot, and these little CNC clips just start to help me apply downward pressure. And those screw clamps, I do this technique, and again, I kind of showed more of these details on Instagram, but I screw clamp the tip. The tip of the screw clamp is grabbing the planks that are already glued, and I make them really tight, and then I shift them sideways. And by shifting them sideways, it puts pressure on the plank that is being glued to the existing plank. And there'll be more examples of that. Now, this is a new hand plane that I got on Amazon, and it's this sort of Japanese style shoulder plane, and it turned out to be really good. And now this is Tony's plane, so every plane gets a little chamfer Every plank going on gets a little chamfer, and every plank that's already there gets the chamfer with the little tiny Japanese shoulder plane. Now those are my clips, and the reason I made them more beefy is because I'm clamping them very tightly, then I'm tapping on them so they push down directly into the plank below. Now you see I have these can't twist clamps, which are super strong. Those are the can't twists, and I put the plank in place, and then I go back in with a hammer and I tap them. And then because the twists got more and more severe as we went up the hull of the boat, I got these clamps that have the little pressure in the middle from Jorgensen. I saw them at Home Depot. They grab top and bottom, and then there's a third angle, so you have like almost X and Y as far as your clamping pressure. Now, the way you do it, you close up one side, and then you build your straight line down the middle, down the keel, and you close it in from the opposite side. And that's what I'm doing here. Now this, I'm trying to figure out what timeline this. I started in May. Now this is probably, this I think is in like September. And this is refreshing when I'm finally able to cut all these planks off that are at the very back of the stern. And that's exciting. One love to Type Bond. Type Bond's been very good to me, and they've been good to me my whole career. I've been using Type Bond since the very beginning. I'm happy we know each other now. And now I'm making some of the more severe curves, or the severe wedges that are closing up the bottom of the boat. So these long, severe wedges, I'm bandsawing them, and I'm hand planing them and shaping them to fit perfectly in place. Now I smudged a lot of glue to fill in cracks and stuff, so that's why it looks fairly messy. I used a lot of the glue to fill in some of the gaps. And this is what you see there. You see me. You got to make sure it fits in one end, and in some cases I was making it fit in one end, clamping it in place, doing whatever I could to get it to stay down, and then shaping the other end in place, because to try and get it to dry fit, and you get it to dry fit, and then it just seems right, and then when you go to glue it, it's too short. So it was a little difficult. So I was clamping one end and then dry fitting the other end, clamping with glue one end and then dry fitting the other end and getting it to fit. And I knew that I was going to put a keel down the middle of this, so if I had a little bit of gapping there, I wasn't going to beat myself up. So you could see all the tools in action that take place to try and close up the bottom. And you see, I couldn't make that severe bend without having those chocks that are right there. And that would be the whiskey plank where those chocks are. They call it the whiskey plank because you put it in, then you're so drained from doing this that you have to have a glass of whiskey. Nick sent me a message and said that he was sorry that he had missed the whiskey plank. But that was fine. Nick's always here with me in spirit. And so there you see how one end is glued. Now I'm confident I can get it banged in there. I'm also using that elevator weight. That yellow elevator weight is great to keep everything nice and pressed down on the stations. This Doug fir is not very pliable. It wants to go straight. And now this is my the whiskey plank. I'm making a nice severe cut on the table saw, freehanding it. And you see that tiny little piece is the whiskey plank. So this is always a big milestone. Very big. And I knew I was going to put a keel so I can cover any sins that was showing, but of course you want to try and do the best you possibly can. Now I started mentioning a squeeze clamp invention that I made for the front, which I don't think I explicitly show, but where the planks come to the very front of the stem, I sharpened both sides of a squeeze clamp so it grabs like fangs, so it pulls the front into the stem. So the squeeze clamp has fangs on it so it doesn't slip, because it's impossible to clamp when you're at the apex of a V. It's hard to clamp in that particular direction. So I'm using DFM's scraper here, getting all the lumps of paint and rather glue, getting all the lumps of glue off before I start shaping it. Now it's like 70% shaped. There's still a lot of beautiful curves to add to all the facets. And I use my Shinto a little bit. I use a little bit of hand plane, but I did early on with the hand plane, but I found the hand plane is dangerous because you can get some good chip out, especially on this. This isn't the soft cedar. This is the Doug fir. And when you throw the hand plane across grain of 6 or 7 planks, some cut perfectly, some get tear out. So you got to be super careful, and it's almost not worth it, because I had to like replace some of the tear out, to be honest with you. And now here with the Shinto, I'm able to shape. I hope I'm calling it the right thing, but you guys know what that's called. Shinza. And this is a lot of work. I wish I had one of those 4 feet long. It would be a lot less knuckle banging. And I'm going across grain because I want one plank to smooth and chooch into the next grain. And using the scraper where I can. But then obviously the palm sander does the dirty work. But look at the physicality of this. I mean, it's so easy to walk away from this project, I'm telling you. But you got to be dedicated. You got to finish what you start. That's what I always say. So now I'm palm sanding, and I'm really seeing some good results here. It gets, good results beget good results. You start seeing some progress, and you're like, oh yeah, I like it. I like what I'm doing here. So when you get good progress, it's just nice. It helps you continue to go on and on. This has got to be the biggest POS belt sander I think I own, but it happened to be what was in the shop at that moment. It was when Craftsman decided to just give up and say, you know what, we're going to make tools, but we don't care at all. And that's what I happen to have. It seems like something you would buy in a grocery store, but my good one was at the other shop. And so now I'm preparing to install the outer stem. And the outer stem goes across all the end grain of the boards there until it eventually falls in between them, and I have to make that space. And this is my outer stem. I take it over here. I'm using Tony's hand plane there, Hillview wood and metal, and I flatten out one side of the stem that I made in the very beginning of May. Now here it is September, October, and it's ready. I'm ready for this part now. And like a jointer, I'm flattening out one side. I could have probably done this on the jointer, to be perfectly honest, but it wasn't that severe. So on one side, I hand plane it, and then I throw it through the table saw on the other side. So I start out with a nice regulated width that is what I need. And now I need to lay it into the planking. Now underneath there is the inner stem. And the inner stem goes from laying underneath the boards to laying in between them. It's part of the difficulty of making the boat. You get that roll of paper plans, but I did spend a lot of time on Google trying to find similar boats, trying to figure out what they did. Now, if you remember in the beginning, here I am. I'm putting screws in it now for the very first time. And it's important to put screws in it before you shape it. Obviously, you don't want to glue it yet. You certainly don't want to glue it, but you got to put the screws in it, and then you begin to shape it, because then you start to establish certain parameters where the edges meet and match. And so I pre-drill it, and then I put the screw in it. And then later on, when I'm ready to glue it, I use those same screw holes. And so here now I'm working on it pretty heartily with the hand plane, with what I can get. I can't get everything with the hand plane, but I do my best. I get most of it. And then this stem, it's fared into both sides on either side, but as it goes down towards the keel, it starts to pop up out of the boat. So it's a little bit of a difficult transition, and just take it slow and steady, and just constantly keep assessing your work and making sure you don't take off too much too fast. So you'll notice kind of like that right there, right, kind of like at my elbow height. Oh, thank you, Carolina Shoes. At my elbow height there, the sides fare directly into the nose. So now I got to take it off to continue to make some more fair curves on there. And I can put it back on the boat with those screws. So I had to take it off to get down at the very bottom, which was too close to the strong back. And now here I am, I'm making what's going to become the keel, which is the outer piece of wood that goes on the bottom right down the middle. Obviously gives the boat some strength and also gives it sort of like a fishtail across the bottom. But I thought I was going to be able to just shape it and put it right on there, but there's such a gradual curve along the bottom of the boat that I needed to turn this into several layers, just like I did the stem, so that I could lay it down and have it take the curve of the bottom of the boat. So I did several, and this is how I did it. I glued 1 to 1, let it dry. Then I glued 2 to 1, let it dry. Then I glued 3 to 1, let it dry. And so this was after a few days of building it up. And you'll notice how the shape of it goes from fairly thin to fairly fat at the end. Right there is the end where there's almost like a little fishtail that sticks out of the bottom of the boat. I'm sure it has a name, but I don't know what it's called. So you see all the various layers to create the different thicknesses all along the keel. This is a few days later. Now I'm shaping it. And I tried a couple of different techniques to shape it. And it's going to be tapered, so once it touches the boat, it's going to be at its widest, and when it comes up off the boat, it's going to get skinny. And so I shaped some of it on the table saw here. I just freestyle a lot of it, which is very dangerous because you could really take off more than you want to take off. And it's also dangerous because you can get hurt, but it's more dangerous because you're going to screw up too much, take off more than you need too fast. And so I said, you know what, let me be a little bit, play it safer, and I'm using my draw knife from Rockler Woodworking. That is an incredible draw knife that Rockler sent me. Not only is it razor sharp, it just has a really nice shape to it. It's got a really beautiful bevel, and if you're using your draw knife correctly, you could work that bevel to your advantage. Now this really long taper is not easy to do. You could easily screw it up. So I'm just using the hand plane, long, gentle strokes, and making sure that we're nice and chooched on the straight line of it all. Mixing up some Total Boat to glue down the keel. And I taped off where I don't want any glue. That goes right down the middle. It covers all my sins that I might have left when I was trying to put in the last couple of planks. And I put the glue I used the sawdust from the palm sander, and I put that in there. And there's a little scarf joint right where the outer stem meets the beginning of the keel. And I make sure everything's glued in place. And then I pre-drilled everything, so now I can go down and throw a screw right where everything goes. Really important. You don't want to be putting those screw holes in it while everything's got goo on it. You should get that on your tools, and things will be slipping around. So now it's probably the next day. I'm peeling the tape off, and now I'm going to shape that in a little bit. And I'm able to take off the stem and finally glue the stem. Gluing the stem in because I had a nice face match. Everything fit nice and tight, so I'm just using the tight bond here. And you can see that scarf joint where the stem meets the keel. And everything gets nice and glued into place. And at this point I was really starting to see. And then I went around and I patched in a bunch of pinholes with some epoxy with some sawdust in it. And now I'm shaping the stem a little bit more, getting it nice and fairly curved to the rest of the boat. And making sure, doing my best. A lot of looking down the barrel of the gun there, standing at one end of the boat, looking down towards the front, and vice versa. Now I'm really getting that bevel in nice and clean. I left a little bit of meat on the bone so that I could work it while it was in place. And here I am working with my long plane. And this, I started noticing when I was turning off various lights in the shop, rows of lights, I started to see little bumps and ripples from the palm sand. And so I made this long board to get rid of some of those. They were very subtle, but they were enough to drive me bananas, so I made this long board and spent hours. I just did a little clip here for YouTube, but I spent hours doing this, long boarding the boat. And I'm just walking by, and I feel it with my eyes closed because you don't want any visual differences to give you an influence to thinking what you might be feeling. And now it's resin day. Now here it is, in, what is it, December. And I'm breaking open my resin cloth from Total Boat. Thank you, Total Boat. And this is fiberglass mesh. And if it was the canoe, it might be enough to go for all the way from side to side. But since I had the keel down the middle and I wasn't able to, fiberglass is a funny material because it doesn't go around curves at all. It doesn't go around curves very well, I should say, especially tight, sharp curves. It'll pucker and not lay down flat. So there's no way I was going to be able to get the fiberglass up and over the keel and back down the other side with all this extra puckering. So I just went right down the center of the keel and from one side down, prepared it, and then went to the other side and prepared it. So you'll see me here just do this one side, and then I think at one point off camera I cut off whatever wasn't glued down. But it's important. You notice how I left it long because it tugs and pulls, and you might end up pulling. If I cut that short right now before, I might end up fighting with an open end. So you'll notice I'm using 2 squeegees holding the mat against the keel while I'm pulling the glue out. Really important. Otherwise, if you just keep pulling the epoxy across the mat, it'll just keep moving the mat down. It'll just keep pulling it off from the other side. That's why I left it long, because I knew it was going to tug a little bit. The blue tape helped somewhat, but having the extra on the other side of the keel helped me in case I ran into any problems. You put it on, you let it soak in, brush it in. And actually you saw me just run across the back there with the scissor because now it was starting to pull up. The extra weight from the other side of the boat was pulling up, so I wasn't staying tucked in the sharp corner of the keel there. And so you'll notice I cut it just to alleviate the weight of it pulling on it. And you want to tend to the epoxy. You want to just keep tugging on it, pushing on it, because once it gets to that honey stage where it's going to start to gel, you want to make sure everything is pushed into place. So I just keep squeegeeing it and making sure I'm getting out anything that's not necessary. And just keep filling in, pushing in, and it gets to the point where, now here it is, it might be the next day. Yep, this is the next day. This is all dried, so now I'm just pulling off anything that was in the way. And my camera's about to fall off the boat. I do one side and I get rid of any little, because now that mat has a little bit of resin in it, a little bit of epoxy, there's a million little sharp edges, and it can get snagged when we do the next step. So I'm just cutting off what I can with the razor blade, but then I go over with a little hand sander and get rid of everything. Now this is the other side, and you just start getting it stuck in place with epoxy. And I'm super careful just to come up the keel, not go over. I don't want to mess up the other side. Now off camera, I didn't really do it completely on camera because it's kind of boring to watch, but I put 4 full coats on both sides. And you'll see me sand a little bit on this side, just again because I didn't want to show sanding 6 different times. But it's just important to just tend to it, make sure you're filling in all the air gaps. And if there's any bubbles or if there's any gaps in the wood, they may or may not fill in. You're just going to get like a hazy spot. So it's important to fill it in with epoxy if you can now, or even before you start doing the mat, fill it in. That's what I'm doing now on the inside of the boat. There's lots of nail holes and stuff because I faced all the grungy stuff in. So there's lots of nail holes. So I'm going over the inside of the boat with an epoxy paste with some sawdust mixed into it, filling in the nail holes and filling in the divots and the dents. I paid more attention to what was happening on the outside of the boat, so the inside's definitely grungy, a little mismatched, but that's okay because the inside gets a lot of details to cover up. And plus you want a texture on the inside of the boat because that's where you're going to be standing. You don't want your feet to be slipping, sliding. The outside gets slippery, the inside gets textury. And now going to the front. That mixing station from Total Boat, by the way, is invaluable. You don't have to touch anything, just hit the pumps and it gives you what you need. I use the pump station for the entire epoxy. And then when I do the inside, of course, I'm going to do it again as well. This here, you got to make sure you have enough mat on the opposite side so that as you start pushing this all in, it starts to fall into place. Really important. You don't want to have to cut any darts or anything. So now it's dried. It's the next day. Cutting it off with a pair of scissors. And there's a lot of mat there. I save it, but you know, I'll throw it away in 2 years from now. Now this is what it looks like right with just the mat pushed in. This will get a light sanding, and then I will put more. And this is like 2 or 3 coats on this side. And you can see it's starting to fill in a little bit and getting a little bit more glassy looking. And now I'm just getting rid of the excess. And this whole thing gets palm sanded. And just getting rid of any sharp edges. You can get a nasty splinter from fiberglass. You got to be careful. And now I palm sand that whole surface. The high spots go down and all the low spots reveal themselves pretty efficiently. So you're just trying to make all the lows and the highs meet in the same spot. And if you do this a couple times between coats, you really start to get a nice smooth finish. Now I'm only brushing on these coats, just starting one end and going to the end. One end, go all the way to the other end. Now a lot of people ask me how I was going to handle these sharp edges. I just went right up to it with the mat, and I'm giving my first coat here, but I might also cover the back of this with mat. That's going to be my logo, the end of the boat, the stern, and the engine. I have a little antique motor I plan on restoring for part 2, so I could run it with this little tiny 1920s Johnson motor I got at the garage sales. But I'm just going to have a sharp edge there. I'm not going to try and wrap the mat over that edge. I'm sure it's going to be fine. There's going to be plenty of secure bracing inside. Also, the mat inside will go up and in, because it's okay to be a little ugly inside. And now that edge you need to really cut off because it's full of resin. Just cutting that off. And I can't believe I got this far. Honestly. So many points where you want to give up, but you don't. You can't. You have to finish. You have to finish for your own sanity. Finish every project you start. That's been my mantra all month. Finish what you start. And so now it's time to pull it off of the mold station, which is a huge milestone. And here I'm prying it up. I unscrewed a couple of the mold stations because I wasn't sure what was going to stay stuck, what wasn't going to stay stuck. But seeing it move like that for the first time is so rewarding when you think it was just a pile of sticks, and now it's this one put together boat. Still a lot of work. I have a lot to do in part 2. I have to build out the whole interior, steps, flooring, seats, gunnels, the deck on the front. Now this is my brother and I picking it up and bringing it over to the other end of the shop. That's my brother Joseph with the blue hoodie on. And now from the other camera angle, it gets a little confusing. The camera flips, and that's me on the other side with a different camera. And now you see the inside for the very first time. Very exciting for me and for you. And you can see all the mold stations. Good thing I put all that tape on there so that it pulled off the mold stations. And now I have to consider we got to do the epoxy on the inside, and just soaking it in. Again, it's such a big milestone. And I got to get those mold stations out of the front. I was a little nervous that I left the screws in the mold station from the very first stem into the mold stations. And that's what I was a little bit nervous about. And so I go and get a hammer to bang it out. And I did leave 2 screws in, but they pulled out right away. And you can see a little behind the scenes here, me setting my camera up for the next shot. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, it pops out easy. But you can see how floppy-doppy the boat is without the gunnels, without the inner epoxy. And I pull that out, and that's good. There's only 2 screws there. I just break them right off. So I was happy about that. I thought I left all 6. There's like 5 screws. I thought I left all 5 screws in it. And here it is, soaking it in. Very, very proud moment here. But there's still a lot to do, which is why I broke this video into 2 parts. But the next thing, me and Mike scrape the inside. I have a few scraping tools. We scrape out any glue bumps. I'm showing you just a little scraping tool I made in the welding station. All the glue bumps get popped out. As many as we sticking up. All the glue drips. There's tons of glue dripped from the top all the way down to the bottom. And you'll see how I left the inside with all the dark wood faced in. And now we're both palm sanding. And at this point, Mike has done a pretty good job. The whole inside's pretty much sanded and getting ready for epoxy. Just cutting off the stems, and that'll get integrated into the deck that's going to get added onto that. I want to begin to thank Carolina Shoes for sponsoring this video. We're going to actually name the boat the Carolina. And thank you to Type On Glue for giving me glue, and thank you to Total Boat for helping me with all the boat products, which obviously still need to be used some more on this project. And I just want to thank you guys, and have a merry, wonderful Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you everybody for sticking with me through the thick and thin of YouTube and the algorithm and everything else. If I just keep finishing stuff and just keep finishing videos in the way that I started, everything's going to be okay. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you.